August 13, 1944. The Falaise Gap, Normandy, occupied France. In a stone farmhouse converted to a dressing station, 7 kilometers south of Falaise. A farmhouse whose Red Cross flags have been placed on the roof and at the gate in the specific and internationally recognized way that the Geneva Convention prescribes for medical facilities. Flags that the Allied air crews are making every reasonable effort to respect in the contested and chaotic airspace above the Falaise corridor. German Sanitätsoffizier Hauptmann Wilhelm Brandt is operating on a man whose wound has become infected because Brandt has not had fresh surgical instruments in 4 days. The infection is streptococcal, visible in the red streaking that extends from the wound margin up the patient's arm toward his axilla, and that means, in the specific and medical language that Brandt's training at the University of Berlin has taught him to read, that without the penicillin or the sulfur drugs, whose supply exhausted 3 days ago, the infection will reach the patient's bloodstream and kill him within 48 hours. Brandt is debriding the wound with instruments that have been wiped with the alcohol from a bottle that is one of 4 remaining in the dressing station's supply, rather than autoclaved, performing the mechanical removal of infected tissue that is the only intervention available to him in the absence of antimicrobial agents, knowing that the procedure will buy the patient time, but not the indefinite time that the patient needs, and that the patient needs more than time. And outside, the roads that should be his evacuation routes are being strafed by American and British P-47s and Typhoons at 15-minute intervals. Brandt's situation is the situation of every German medical officer in the Falaise sector on August 13th. But to understand what his situation is, it is necessary to understand what the German medical system was designed to be, and how far from that design the pocket's reality has placed it. The German Army's 7th Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser and the 5th Panzer Army under General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach are in the process of being encircled by a closing pincer whose northern jaw is the Canadian 1st Army, driving south from Caen under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, and whose southern jaw is the American 15th Corps of the 3rd Army, driving north from Le Mans under Major General Wade Hyslop, and the closure of the gap between those two jaws, the gap that still exists between Falaise in the north and Argentan in the south, the gap whose width on August 13 is approximately 25 miles, but that has been narrowing by miles each day since the American 15th Corps reached Argentan on August 13th, is consuming the logistical infrastructure of the encircled force at a rate that the German medical services planning has not accommodated. The planning has been based on the assumption that the medical service would be able to function in a stabilized rear area, while the combat elements conducted the Mortain counteroffensive that Hitler has ordered, whose success would have pushed the Allied forces west and opened the supply lines that the pocket is closing. The assumption was wrong from the moment the Mortain attack stalled. The Mortain offensive has failed. The rear area is not stabilized. The medical services dressing stations and field hospitals and surgical clearing companies and ambulance trains are inside the closing pocket, serving a casualty load that the 2 weeks of the pocket's formation have produced at rates exceeding the service's capacity. Without the supply lines that connect the forward medical units to the pharmacy depots and the sterilization facilities and the whole logistical chain whose function the German military medical system has been assuming will be available, and without the evacuation routes whose security the medical system's planning has assumed would be provided by the tactical situations management. The tactical situation is not being managed. The tactical situation is collapsing at a pace that the German logistical system, of which the medical service is one component, has not been designed to remain functional within. What Brandt is experiencing on August 13th is not a breakdown of the German medical service in the institutional sense, not a failure of the German medical system's design, not a failure of the individual doctors and orderlies and ambulance drivers whose professional commitment and physical endurance have been sustaining the service through 2 months of the most intense combat the Western theater has produced, and not a failure of the medical supply system whose pre-war planning and whose wartime logistics have been maintaining adequate supply to the German army's forward medical elements throughout the Normandy campaign. It is the breakdown of the German army in Normandy, expressed in the specific and immediate language of a surgical theatre, without instruments performing operations on men who need operations because the pace of the Allied advance has produced casualties at rates and locations that the medical service cannot absorb. Brandt is not a symbol of institutional failure. He is a symptom of operational catastrophe, the specific and individual human expression of what happens to a medical system when the army it serves loses control of its own operational situation at the speed that the Allied breakout has produced. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket is the operational consequence of the German army's strategic miscalculation at Mortain. On August 7th, Hitler has ordered the 7th Army to counterattack west through the American positions at Mortain, reach Avranches on the coast, and sever the supply lines of the Third Army that has just activated and is driving south and east in the exploitation that has been the Normandy operation's strategic objective since D-Day. The counterattack is real. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division drive west with the specific and characteristic tactical competence of the German armored arm and achieve an initial advance of several miles, reaching the approaches to Mortain town in the early hours of August 7 before the American defenses have fully organized the response to an attack whose timing and axis have been partially concealed by the specific and aggressive operational security that the German movement orders have prescribed. The advance produces in the first 6 hours the optimism that initial tactical success produces in any operation. Reports of progress, reports of American positions overrun, reports of the specific and forward momentum that translates, in the German operational reporting system's language, into projected achievement of the phase objectives that the attack plan has established. The optimism does not survive contact with the 30th Infantry Division's resistance at Hill 314 north of Mortain, whose men, surrounded on their hill by the German advance that has passed them on both sides, are directing artillery fire from a position that the German forces cannot easily reduce because the hill's height and the clarity of observation from its summit make it an artillery fire control resource whose destruction the German attack cannot afford the time to accomplish before the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19 Tactical Air Command appear with the morning light and begin the systematic destruction of the German armor on the exposed Mortain road that proves to be among the most concentrated examples of tactical air effectiveness in the European theater. By August 11, the fuel shortage that the German operational planning has underestimated brings the advance to a halt. The counterattack's failure produces the Falaise trap, produces it not merely as a military encirclement, but as the specific and consequential entrapment of the German army's entire logistical and support infrastructure that the encirclement implies when the encircled force is an entire army group whose supply depots and repair shops and medical facilities and ammunition dumps and headquarters elements are inside the developing pocket, along with the combat forces that a more timely withdrawal would have moved east of the Seine. While the German armored forces have been driving west toward Avranches, the American 15th Corps under Major General Wade Heislip has been driving east and north from Le Mans in the advance that Patton has been directing, with the specific and operational awareness of a commander who has seen the pocket's possibility from the moment the Mortain counterattack committed the German armored reserve to the wrong direction, reaching Argenton on August 13th and completing the southern jaw of the encirclement. The Canadian First Army, under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, pressing south from the Caen area, in Operation Totalize beginning August 7th, and then in Operation Tractable beginning August 14th, has been driving toward Falaise, whose capture will close the northern jaw. The gap between the two jaws is 25 miles on August 13th. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, between them approximately 100,000 combat personnel, and with them the entire support infrastructure that the two armies have been maintaining in the Normandy sector since June, are between the jaws. The German military medical system that is caught inside this pocket is a system whose planning has been built for a different operational situation. Built, in the specific institutional way of military planning, for the range of situations that the German Army's prior operational experience has identified as the planning basis, and that has therefore not been built for the specific situation of a pocket whose closure is proceeding faster than the medical system can adapt to. The German Heer's medical organization in 1944 is structured around the battlefield's traditional hierarchy, whose components in the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army sectors include forward aid posts at the company and battalion level, whose function is immediate stabilization and the application of the first aid measures that prevent the most rapidly fatal wound complications, manned by Sanitätssoldaten, whose training equips them for exactly this level of care and no more. Main dressing stations at the regimental level, whose function is the triage and initial treatment of the wounded, who survive the forward aid post, and whose wounds require more than first aid. Manned by Sanitätsoffiziere, whose medical training is the full medical curriculum of the German university system, supplemented by the military medicine course that the Wehrmacht's medical training system delivers. Field hospitals at the divisional level, whose function is the definitive surgical care of the cases whose wounds can be addressed with the resources available in a forward field hospital, and the stabilization and preparation for evacuation of the cases whose wounds require the more comprehensive resources of the base hospital system, and surgical clearing companies and hospital trains at the corps level whose function is to receive the wounded from the forward elements, perform the emergency surgery that cannot wait for evacuation, and move the stable cases to the permanent hospitals in the Army rear area where the full range of military medicine's capabilities can be applied. The system has been functioning, however imperfectly given the specific and demanding conditions of the Normandy campaign. The hedgerow terrain that makes ground vehicle movement slow and hazardous, the Allied air superiority that limits daylight vehicle movement to risk-accepting transit rather than planned logistics, the casualty rates that the 2 months of fighting have produced at levels whose sustained accumulation has been straining the system's capacity even before the pocket began forming, throughout the campaign's 2 months since June 6, because the campaign's fighting, however intense and however costly, has maintained enough territorial stability to allow the forward medical units to evacuate their patients to the rear and the rear hospitals to receive patients and eventually to discharge them to convalescence facilities or to the German military hospital system in the occupied territories and in Germany itself. The system depends on the existence of a rear area, on the existence of roads and rail lines whose security allows the ambulance convoys to move from the forward positions to the base hospitals without being interdicted by Allied air power or cut off by Allied ground advances, on the existence of the fuel supply that powers the sterilization equipment and the surgical lighting and the generators that the hospital's electrical systems require, on the existence of the communication networks that allow the corps medical officer to direct resources to the points of greatest need, and the divisional medical officers to report their status and requirements to the corps level. These dependencies are not peculiarities of the German medical system. They are the dependencies of any military medical system whose design has been built for the operational situation that modern warfare produces when it is functioning according to the planning assumptions whose validity determines the plan's feasibility. The Falaise pocket destroys all of these dependencies simultaneously. There is no longer a meaningful rear area within the pocket, in the sense that military operational planning requires a rear area to exist, a space behind the front where the logistical and medical and command functions can operate with a margin of security that allows them to plan for the next day's operations rather than to manage the current hour's survival. Every position within the pocket is either a frontline position or is one Allied advance away from becoming one, and the specific and constant presence of Allied air power above every position within the pocket means that even the positions that are not currently under ground force pressure are under the continuous observation and potential attack of the P-47s and Typhoons and Spitfires, whose coverage has been making daylight movement within the pocket a hazardous activity since the Mortain attack's failure. The roads that connect the pocket's positions to each other and to the narrowing gap in the southwest. The roads through Argentan and through Trun and through Chambois that represent the remaining evacuation routes and that the German logistical system has been routing its essential traffic on since the pocket began forming, are under continuous Allied air interdiction that reduces vehicle movement on them during daylight hours to the specific category of very fast movement that accepts significant losses as the price of transit. This is not a category of movement that ambulance convoys can employ. August 16, 1944. The road between Trun and Chambois, Normandy. The column of German vehicles attempting to use this road for withdrawal includes, at 14:30 hours, 3 ambulances marked with Red Cross identification. The caduceus symbols whose international law protection has been honored more consistently by both sides in the Western theater than in any other theater of the war, and whose presence in the column has been intended by the medical unit's senior Sanitätsoffizier to provide some measure of protection against the P-47s, whose circuit patterns above this road section have been producing a 15-minute destruction cycle since dawn. The P-47 attack at 14:30 comes in from the west, using the afternoon sun behind it as the approach that minimizes the ground observer's visual warning time, and that the P-47's pilots have been using for exactly this reason since the Cobra breakout, at approximately 300 knots, pulling up from the low-level approach that the road's corridor of trees has been channeling toward this specific stretch of open road. The bombs it drops. 500-pound general-purpose bombs carried on underwing racks land in the road's center 100 meters ahead of the column's lead vehicle. The concussion from the detonation reaches the ambulances 0.2 seconds after the visual flash that the drivers have already responded to by the Normandy-earned instinct of pressing themselves below the level of the windscreen. The ambulances do not move during the attack. Their drivers have learned in 3 weeks of operating on Normandy's roads under Allied air superiority that movement on the road during an air attack draws the following aircraft's attention to the moving vehicle, and that stillness, however counterintuitive in the presence of falling bombs and the bodily urgency to be anywhere other than where the bombs are landing, is the survival tactic that repeated experience has established as the least lethal available option. They are still. The bombs land. The men in the ambulances, whose wounds are the wounds of men who should not be subjected to the specific and violent physics of bomb detonation at 100 meters, experience what the men in the ambulances always experience in these moments. The shockwave that the ambulance's metal body transmits from the air to their bodies, the dust that the detonation throws through every gap in the vehicle's body, and the specific and sustained terror of lying wounded and unable to move on a road that is being bombed. The bombs from the first P-47 land in a crater that the road's surface preserves as an obstacle for the remainder of the day. The ambulances are not hit, but the road is now interrupted, and the column, which has been moving at walking pace because of the density of the traffic and the condition of the road surface, must wait while the engineers whose presence somewhere in the column's rear has been the specific reason that the column has been able to transit this road section at all work to fill the crater sufficiently for vehicle transit to resume. The wait takes 43 minutes. 43 minutes measured in the specific and immediate way of men in the ambulances whose wounds are producing the continuous pain signals that inadequately treated wounds produce, whose morphine ration has been either administered or exhausted before this road section, and whose experience of the 43 minutes is the experience of people waiting for pain to end in conditions where the mechanism for ending it is unavailable, and where the sounds that reach them through the ambulance's body, the secondary detonations of the German vehicles hit by the earlier P-47 pass, the engine sounds of the engineers' recovery equipment working at the crater, the distant rumble that the guns of the closing Allied forces produce on the southern and eastern horizons, do not suggest that the wait's end will produce the conditions of safety that the ambulance is supposed to be taking them to. During those 43 minutes, the wounded men in the 3 ambulances receive no care beyond what the medical orderlies riding in the ambulances can provide from the depleted supplies that the ambulances carry. A second dressing for the wound that has soaked through the first, a hand held, or a word spoken in the specific and necessary way of men whose professional medical resources are exhausted and whose human resources are not. The orderlies do what they can. They are waiting for the engineers. The engineers are working. And somewhere further south, the American and Canadian forces, whose advance has made this road the only remaining option for this column, are continuing to close the gap. The near failure in the German medical services attempt to maintain any functioning capability inside the Falaise pocket arrives not in a single dramatic incident, but in the cumulative collapse that the combination of casualties, supply failure, and interdiction produces by August 18th, when the German 7th Army's Sanitätstruppe submits to Army headquarters a report that the Army's medical officer reads as the most alarming single document in his professional career. The report states that the forward field hospitals in the pocket have a combined remaining anesthesia supply adequate for approximately 200 additional surgical procedures, that the surgical instrument sterilization equipment in 4 of the 7 operating divisional medical units has ceased to function due to fuel shortage, that the morphine supply has been exhausted at 6 of the 8 core dressing stations, and that the ambulance vehicle fleet available for movement within the pocket has been reduced by air attack and breakdown to approximately 30% of the fleet's authorized strength. The report also states, with the professional understatement of a medical document whose author understands that the document must be readable by its recipients, the Army commander and his staff, whose operational decisions are already being made in conditions of extreme stress, without producing in them the paralysis that the document's contents would justify if they were presented in the language that describes what the numbers mean for the men whose situations they quantify, that the wounded population within the pocket awaiting evacuation or definitive surgical treatment is estimated at between 8,000 and 12,000 men. 8,000 to 12,000 wounded men waiting for surgical care in a pocket whose road network is under continuous air interdiction, whose medical supply is exhausted, and whose evacuation routes are narrowing by the hour. The range in the estimate reflects the specific and characteristic uncertainty of casualty estimation in an encircled force whose medical units cannot communicate with each other with the reliability that accurate reporting requires. Some of the dressing stations have not been in radio contact with the Corps Medical Officer for 3 days, and the figure of 8,000 to 12,000 is the range that the Corps Medical Officer's last available information supports, rather than a figure whose confidence interval reflects the actual situation. The 7th Army's medical officer forwards the report to Army Group B with a covering note that says the situation is critical and that evacuation priority for the medical equipment and the most seriously wounded must be established immediately if any residual medical capability is to be preserved for the force that escapes the pocket. Army Group B under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who has been replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model on August 17th in one of Hitler's characteristic relief of command decisions in moments of operational crisis, so that the report is actually received by Model's headquarters, whose first week in command has been the week of the pocket's final closure, receives the report and the covering note. The headquarters that receives the report is a headquarters managing an operational crisis of the first magnitude. The Allied breakthrough is not confined to the Falaise sector. The Third Army's exploitation eastward has been proceeding simultaneously with the Northern forces' drive toward Falaise, and the German defensive situation in France, as of August 18, is not merely the crisis of the Falaise pocket, but the crisis of the entire German military position in the Western Theater. Army Group B is in no position to establish the evacuation priority that the medical officer's covering note requests, because Army Group B's communications with the pocket's internal elements have been degraded by the interdiction of the radio relay stations that the Allied air campaign has been systematically destroying since August 15th. Because the forces controlling the gap have enough tactical resources to close it within days, regardless of what Army Group B directs. And because Army Group B's operational priority for those days is maintaining any kind of communication and command coherence in the face of the collapse that is simultaneous across the entire front. The medical report is filed. The wound population continues to grow. The gap closes on August 21. in the operational sense that matters for the German army's experience of its meaning. The sense that the last coordinated German passage through the narrowing gap between Chambois and the Polish First Armored Division's positions is no longer possible. The precise moment of the pocket's closure is contested in the historical record, whose multiple accounts reflect the specific and chaotic reality of the closing battle's geography. The Canadian First Army's 4th Armored Division and the Polish 1st Armored Division, under Major General Stanislaw Maciek, pressing south through Trun toward Chambois, in the approach that has been the Canadian-Polish sector's operational objective since Totalize began, make contact with the American 90th Infantry Division at Chambois on the evening of August 19, in the meeting that the Allied operational planning has designated as the pocket's closure. But the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps, fighting from outside the pocket to maintain a corridor through the Polish positions, and the German forces inside the pocket fighting desperately to hold a passage open that allows the remnants of the encircled army to escape, continue the battle in the specific and ferocious way of men who have been told, accurately, that the gap is the difference between escape and capture, and whose motivation is therefore not the defensive determination to hold ground, but the offensive desperation to maintain movement through ground they know is closing around them. The fight continues through August 20 and August 21, when the combined pressure of the Polish and Canadian forces from the north and the American forces from the south finally seals the pocket in the operational sense that no coordinated German passage through it is any longer possible. By August 21, the medical situation inside the former pocket, the roads now clogged with the wreckage of the German army's retreat through the gap, with the burned vehicles and the dead horses and the abandoned equipment and the specific and terrible landscape of an army destroyed in detail at the speed that Allied air power, Allied armored exploitation produces, reflects the outcome of the 10 days since August 13, with the specific and terrible arithmetic of a military medical system that has been operating beyond its capacity, without resupply and without evacuation, in the most intense sustained combat environment that the Western theater has produced. The first Allied medical teams entering the pocket find conditions that exceed the professional preparation of medical officers who have been briefed on the pocket situation, but who have been unable to prepare fully for what the arithmetic of 8,000 to 12,000 wounded without adequate care over 10 days actually produces in the physical space of a former army rear area. The German army's medical officers who are captured with the pocket's surrender, in the general accounting of approximately 60,000 soldiers surrendered or captured, with estimates of 10,000 killed in the final fighting, and an unknown number of wounded who have died of their wounds, in the conditions of inadequate care that the pocket's last days have produced, include men who have been operating without sterilized instruments for up to 5 days, who have improvised sterilization by boiling in whatever water could be heated over any available fuel source, who have been making decisions about which wounds to treat and which to palliate with the diminishing supplies available to palliative care in the specific and agonizing way that triage under resource constraint always makes those decisions. By estimating which patients will survive with the care available and providing it to them, and providing what comfort the available morphine and the available presence can provide to the patients whose wounds exceed what the available care can address. The men they have been operating on with these resources are the men who were wounded in the pocket's final days, when the American and Canadian and Polish pressure was at its maximum, and the German defensive positions were being consumed at the rate that the converging Allied forces' firepower produced. The wounded men who survive are the wounded men whose wounds were survivable without adequate surgical care, whose bodies could manage the infection and the blood loss and the tissue damage that their wounds have produced in the conditions of the pocket's final days, managed with the first aid and the improvised care and the specific physiological resilience that determines which men survive the conditions that should kill them and which men die of conditions that adequate care would have been able to treat. The wounded men whose wounds required adequate surgical care and did not receive it, the abdominal wounds that needed emergency surgery, the limb wounds that became infected in the absence of antimicrobials, the vascular injuries that required surgical intervention to stop the bleeding, that slower-moving tissue loss obscures until it cannot be obscured, are among the 10,000 dead whose specific and individual deaths the Falaise Pocket's casualty accounting attributes to the fighting's violence, without distinguishing between those who died in the fighting and those who died in the farmhouses and the field hospitals and the ditches where they had been placed and where the care they needed was not available. The German field hospital system has not been overwhelmed by the speed of the Allied breakout at Falaise, in the simple sense of a medical system surprised by more casualties than its capacity could handle, though it has been that also, since the casualty rates that the pocket's closing combat has produced have exceeded the medical system's processing capacity even before the supply failures made the processing capacity's limit irrelevant. It has been overwhelmed by something more fundamental, by the systematic and irreversible destruction of the logistical and operational conditions that any medical system, however capable in its design and however dedicated in its personnel, requires to function. A surgeon requires instruments. Instruments require sterilization. Sterilization requires fuel and water and time. All of these require a supply system that can deliver them. The supply system requires roads. The roads require security. The security requires military control of the territory through which the roads run. The Allied breakout at Falaise destroyed the military control. Everything else collapsed in sequence. The roads that carry the supply and the evacuation. The fuel that powers the sterilization equipment. The communication networks that direct resources to the points of greatest need. The security that allows the ambulances to move. All of these have been consumed by the speed of the Allied advance, whose pace has converted the German rear area into a killing ground, and whose air power has made the killing ground's roads into fire lanes that medical columns transit at the cost that the 15-minute P-47 cycle imposes. The speed of the Allied breakout at Falaise did not overwhelm the German field hospitals in the sense that their capacity was exceeded by the volume of patients, though it was exceeded, and the triage decisions that the Sanitätsoffiziere were making in the pocket's final days were the triage decisions of men who had more patients than their remaining resources could treat, and who were choosing, in the specific and agonizing way that triage always chooses, which patients receive care and which patients receive presence. It destroyed the conditions that the German field hospitals needed to exist. The roads and the fuel and the instruments and the drugs and the security and the evacuation routes and the communication networks and the whole logistical substrate whose maintenance is the prerequisite for any medical system's function. A substrate that the Allied breakout consumed in the specific and sequential way that the collapse of an encircled army's logistical position always consumes it. From the outside in, from the supply lines first, through the evacuation routes next, into the forward medical units last, until Hauptmann Brandt in his stone farmhouse 7 kilometers south of Falaise is performing surgery with unsterilized instruments on men who need penicillin, and the only thing between this patient and death from infection is the surgeon's hands and the infection's progress and the time that neither of them controls.